The man known to history as Hermann Wilhelm Göring was born in the Marienbad Sanatorium on the 12th of January 1893. Göring was born in the town of Rosenheim in the Kingdom of Bavaria to Heinrich Ernst Göring and Franziska Tiefenbrunn. Göring's father, Heinrich, had already been married once and had 5 children. He would marry Tiefenbrunn at the age of 45 in London, having been sent there by Otto von Bismarck on assignment to study the British method of colonial administration. Before studying British colonial administration methods, he served as a cavalry officer in the Bavarian army, and following his studies, he was reassigned to the oversight of German territories in Southwest Africa. Heinrich's time as Minister-Resident for Southwest Africa would be relatively short, as he would soon be appointed the Ambassador of Haiti. Hermann Göring's mother, Franziska Tiefenbrunn, had given birth to 3 other children, Karl, Olga and Paula, before Hermann, and when Göring was born, his mother returned to Haiti without him, leaving him in Frut, Bavaria, with a family friend, and for the next 3 years, Göring would live with the Gauff family, holding much resentment for his mother for leaving him behind. So much so that when they finally reunited in 1896 and she tried to give him a hug, Göring ran at his mother, trying to punch her for leaving him for so long. Subsequently, the family moved to Berlin and lived in Fregestrasse in the Friedenau suburb, and from a very early age, Göring wanted to become an officer in the German military, just like his father. The family dynamic shifted dramatically during Göring's childhood as his father's friend Dr. Hermann Eppenstein, who was Hermann's godparent, spoiled the Göring children, and when Dr. Eppenstein returned to Germany, he bought the castle Mautendorf in Austria, not far from the Bavarian border. He would also buy a second, smaller castle called Feldenstein, near the city of Nuremberg. Göring would come to see Feldenstein become the family's seat of nobility, yet this was only possible due to his affluent godfather. Dr. Eppenstein was also friendly with Franziska, and she would become Eppenstein's mistress, humiliating her frail husband, as when Eppenstein visited, he would be given the finest bedroom, with Franziska's bedroom not far away, while Heinrich was placed on the ground floor and was forbidden from entering that part of the castle. He would take little to no part in raising Göring, as Dr. Eppenstein took over the care of the children. Dr. Eppenstein was a Christian, as he had been baptized as a child, yet his family's roots were Jewish. He would often write to the Görings about directing their children's lives in areas such as education, marriage, and investments. While Göring's father was obsessed with his past glory, his godfather embodied true power, yet Göring resented the relationship between Eppenstein and his mother. He was spoiled as a child and received little discipline, stating he was "daddy's darling." He was a difficult pupil and left his first school in Frut in 1900, and in 1904 he was sent to boarding school in Ansbach, which he hated, so much so that he spent his last change on a ticket home, whilst making sure to cut all the stringed instruments before leaving. His parents insisted he go back to school, but he stubbornly resisted. He was unable to cope with the restrictions placed upon him at Ansbach, and he believed his defiance towards authority figures was a sign of natural heroism. His father said historical greatness ran through their blood, and this saying would inspire Göring towards a grand vision. In 1905, it was agreed upon by his father and Eppenstein to send him to the cadet school in Karlsruhe in Baden. Ironically, the two did not anticipate Göring's positive response to the idea of attending the academy, as he thought it was finally a school fit for a hero. By 1909, he enrolled into a military training college at Lichterfelde near Berlin. He enjoyed the daily regime of military life and also his solitary nights spent alone. He left Lichterfelde with the highest distinction available at the academy, and by March of 1912 he had joined the Prince Wilhelm Regiment. He would be part of the 112th Infantry Regiment stationed at Mulhouse, and by 1913 Göring would become a commissioned officer. It would be only a year later that the tenuous friendship with Eppenstein would end in 1913, forcing the family from Feldenstein. As a result, Heinrich moved the family to Berlin, and shortly afterwards passed away. Though the loss of his father was devastating, Göring settled into life at Mulhouse and became friends with Lieutenant Bruno Lürzer. Mulhouse was a border garrison town in German Alsace, with no more than a mile separating Germany and France. Meanwhile, in Sarajevo, the Austro-Hungarian heir apparent to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, had been assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a member of Young Bosnia, in 1914. This assassination resulted in the July Crisis, which saw the diplomatic relationship of European countries deteriorate. When war was declared, Lieutenant Göring and his men were ordered to retreat behind the Rhine to take up a better defensive position, and the French quickly took the town. One of Göring's first missions would be to provide a scouting report of the French position in Mulhouse, although Göring, eager in the heat of the moment, pushed the French out of the town. He captured 4 French dragoon horses and returned to base with his war prizes. On the following day, Göring and his platoon entered the town on bicycles and engaged the French troops in a skirmish, sending them into a panic. Göring's success led him to concoct a plan to capture General Paul Pau, but a nervous rifleman gave away their position when he misfired his gun. With their position compromised, the platoon returned back to base empty-handed, leaving Göring bitter about his lost opportunity to gain instant fame. Göring became an experienced and reliable junior officer, but would be unexpectedly struck down with rheumatism. He was sent to a hospital in Freiburg to recover and kept in touch with Lürzer, who had entered into an air training school. Göring applied for a transfer to the training school, but was denied. Despite the official denial, Göring took the matter into his own hands by arranging his own transfer to be trained as an aviator. Göring would be court-martialed for his actions, but was never punished, as he was attached to the 25th Field Air Detachment of Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm's Fifth Army. The two friends carried out reconnaissance missions, which required photographing and drawing the enemy's entrenchment and gun placements. The two became legends, as Göring drew the chain of forts surrounding Verdun and shot at enemies with a pistol when Lürzer flew low enough. The pair would be awarded the first-class Iron Cross for their bravery. Flying reconnaissance took up much of Göring's spring in 1915, and he eventually learned Morse code, enabling him to send messages down to the base whilst in the sky. The first Morse code message he sent was, quote, "You can stop firing, you won't hit the bloody target anyhow," when the French Air Force commenced a raid on the Crown Prince's headquarters during the visit of Crown Princess Cecily. Göring and Lürzer responded by badly damaging a French plane with a pistol before dropping a small bomb on a French aerodrome. As a result of this raid, Göring decided to carry an improvised machine gun when flying, becoming the first German airman to bring a machine gun with him into aerial combat. Once aviation technology had improved, Göring decided he wanted to pilot his own plane rather than being relegated to being just an observer. Göring and Lürzer both attended senior meetings despite their low rank, but their experience in the air proved too valuable for them to be left out. At this time, he caught the attention of Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm and returned to Freiburg to gain his wings. He never crashed a plane during his training, and in October 1915 he gained the title of Jagdflieger, also known as a pursuit fighter. Following the award of his new title, Göring and Lürzer joined the Jagdstaffel 5, the newest fighter group, which was formed to fight on the Western Front. Göring saw aerial combat in November when he engaged the new British aircraft, a Handley Page, which was a large aircraft for the time, supporting a crew of 2, the pilot along with one other person, who would observe, repair, and shoot at enemy aircraft, although Göring's Aviatik was more nimble than the Handley Page, which allowed him to outmaneuver and take its gunner out of action. Göring was attacked by a squad of Sopwith fighters, and his engine and fuel tank were hit. He sustained an injury himself and began to lose consciousness until the sound of machine gun fire brought him out of his state of shock, allowing him to pull his throttle up from the nosedive his plane was in. He crash-landed in the cemetery of a church next to a field hospital, where he was pulled from the wreckage and operated on for a critical wound to his hip, which, if not operated on, would have caused him to bleed out. In total, 60 bullet holes were found in the fuselage of his Aviatik. Göring's wounds left him out of action for over a year, but it was during this time that the art of air combat was rapidly developing. This new form of warfare was greatly romanticized as a deadly duel, in which the ace with the best wit would win the day. In the meantime, Lürzer was appointed as commandant to Field Squadron 26, based in Mulhouse, where Göring would join him in 1916. Göring's reputation as a fighter pilot had spread, and he received the Zering Lion with swords, the Karl Friedrich Order, along with the Hohenzollern Medal with swords, 3rd class. In May of 1917, he was put in charge of the 27th Air Squadron, which flew out of the same airfield as the 26th Squadron near Flanders. Göring and Lürzer squadrons would combine to create a new unit called the Jagdgeschwader, commanded by Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron. In 1918, Germany launched an offensive against the Triple Entente on the Western Front, but by April, Richthofen was killed in action, leading to Göring's rapid rise up the ranks. In May, Göring was preparing to take off when his adjutant stopped him, informing him he had been awarded the Pour le Mérite, the highest honor that could be given to an individual for continual bravery on the battlefield. Richthofen was soon replaced by Captain Reinhardt in May, but he was killed shortly after crashing an experimental plane Göring had recently flown himself. On the 7th of July, Göring was selected to command the Jagdgeschwader, and in a ceremony he was given the Richthofen emblem, a walking stick which had been passed down by the previous commanders. Göring would keep this walking stick with him till the day he died. As the end of the war approached, the orders the soldiers received became increasingly confusing and hypocritical. For example, on the 10th of November, he received instructions telling him to surrender their planes to the American forces, whilst another order told him to evacuate all of their equipment to Darmstadt. And then, on the 11th of November, the official news of the armistice reached the troops, along with the order to halt the evacuations. But Göring refused. He instead told his fighters to fly to Darmstadt, although some would surrender to the French at Strasbourg as intended. Others mistook Göring's instructions and flew to Mannheim, where soldiers and workers' councils had revolted and confiscated the pilots' firearms. Word reached Göring, and without hesitation, he and the rest of his squadron flew to Mannheim. Göring threatened he would shoot the aerodrome if the weapons were not released, and the revolutionaries obliged. The squadron flew to Darmstadt, where Göring ordered them to crash land their planes so they would not fall into the hands of the enemy. Göring would be honorably discharged from the German Air Force with the rank of captain in the Bavarian town of Aschaffenburg, and it was here that he discovered that he was a gifted orator, and his men would often cheer him on as he raged against the German people for their betrayal of the army, who had sacrificed so much to protect them. Göring lived a nomadic life after his resignation from the army and would spend some time in Denmark. In 1920, Göring was asked by Count Erich von Rosen, a renowned explorer, to fly him to his estate on Lake Bavon. However, the weather was horrendous, and by the time they landed on the frozen lake, it was too late for Göring to return. Count Rosen offered Göring to stay the night in the castle, where he would meet Count Rosen's wife's sister, Baroness Karin von Kantzow. Göring quickly fell in love with the woman during the night, as the group sang songs. Karin was 5 years older than Göring and was married with an 8-year-old son, but she was estranged from her Swedish husband and was looking for the love and affection Göring was offering. By the end of Göring's stay, they had arranged to meet Karin's parents at their home in Sweden. Karin's father was Baron Karl Frock, an officer in the Swedish army, while her mother was Baroness Huldini Beamish-Fock, who was an Englishwoman whose family had lived in Ireland. Karin's sister Fanny was married to Count Richard von Wilhelmowitz-Müllendorf, who was an officer in the German army but had been killed in the Great War. The loss of her brother-in-law made her sympathetic towards Germany and also towards Göring, yet the prospect of divorce as well as Göring's unemployed status made the match unlikely, and so Göring returned to Berlin in 1921 to enroll in a university to study political science at the age of 28. Meanwhile, Karin convinced her husband to divorce her, and he even gave her a sum of money which would allow her to marry Göring. The couple married in Munich on the 3rd of February 1922 and moved to Hockreuth in the Bavarian Alps, roughly 50 miles from Munich. The couple were avid nationalists, and it did not take long for them to become involved in politics. Göring met Hitler in 1922 and soon became active in the party. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, or Nazi Party, was based in Munich, as the Bavarian government was ineffective at handling radical political parties. The core of the party lay in the Sturmabteilung, which was composed of working-class and ex-military men, who guarded party meetings, whilst also instigating fights with other political parties. In fact, the NSDAP were a welcomed political party, as they frequently attacked the Communist Party, who were not welcomed at all since being ousted from power. As a result of Göring's interest in the party and his prior military experience, Hitler offered Göring a position in the NSDAP as the leader of the Sturmabteilung. Göring set out two goals as leader. He said, quote, "At first it was important to weld the SA into a stable organization, to discipline it and to make of it a completely reliable unit which had to carry out the orders which I or Adolf Hitler should give it. I strive from the beginning to bring into the SA those members of the party who were young and idealistic enough to devote their free time and their entire energies to it. In the second place, I tried to find recruits among laborers. Göring's exploits from the Great War made him an ideal candidate to run the SA, as he was held in high regard by counter-revolutionaries as well as nationalists wishing to smash the Communist Party. Later in life, Hitler would praise Göring, whilst also dismissing the later work of Ernst Röhm when he said, quote, "He is the only one of its heads that ran the SA properly. I gave him a dishevelled rabble. In a short time, he had organized a division of 11,000 men." The two formed an unlikely duo, as Göring was a highly decorated officer receiving orders from Hitler, who was low-born and never achieved a rank higher than a Meldegänger, or officer's runner. It was at this time that the Görings moved to a new home in the suburb of Obermenzing in the city of Munich. It was modestly furnished, and their home became the meeting place for the NSDAP. During one of these meetings, Göring would meet Rudolf Hess, a Great War pilot, Alfred Rosenberg, a self-proclaimed philosopher, and Captain Ernst Röhm, an active military member with connections to weapons depots. These men were needed to formulate the rise of the NSDAP, and were exactly who Göring was comfortable being around. Both Göring and Röhm's relationship with Hitler was similar, as Hitler found a way to leverage the best traits out of his leaders whilst also keeping the unruly aspects in line. Furthermore, Röhm's active status in the Bavarian military allowed for easy recruitment into the SA, and whilst Röhm viewed Göring more as a rival than as an ally, his own memoirs never outright declared his disdain for the man. After all, Göring was useful, as he was more even-tempered and unwilling to make rash decisions, unlike Röhm, who was given the title of Chief of Staff of the SA. However, it was Göring who was truly in charge. Röhm would not be given command of the SA until 1930, yet throughout 1923, Göring strenuously organized and drilled the SA in the woods outside of Munich and maintained a hesitant relationship with the state government. Violence erupted between the Communists and the Nazis on the 1st of May 1923, a rallying day for Communist members, and as a result of the 1st of May incident, Göring and the others were forced to rethink their strategy to grow the NSDAP. It would not be long before Hitler and Göring were both begging General von Lossow to join them, as Gustav Stresemann had become Chancellor and had enacted martial law, noticing the increased political unrest. In part, this declaration was made because of the Black Reichswehr, under the direction of Major Buchröcker, who now threatened the government. The Black Reichswehr was a secret organization within the Reichswehr, which was associated with the secret society known as Feme, an organization marked by extreme violence, even worse than the street violence perpetrated by the Nazis and the Communists. Stresemann's objection towards passive resistance to the French occupation of the Ruhr deeply infuriated many Germans, especially the Nazi Party. Göring attempted one last time to convince General von Lossow to break his agreement to stay in line with Berlin in order to join them in the coup to unseat Stresemann and his government. This would not come to fruition, leaving Hitler and Göring without an ally. However, a prime opportunity would come along, which prompted the need to act. Gustav von Kahr, the new state commissioner for Bavaria, Colonel Hans-Ritten von Seisser, the premier of Bavaria, and General von Lossow had announced a meeting on the 8th of November 1923 at the Bürger Bräukeller Beer Hall, where they were going to give a speech to 3,000 people. It was believed by Hitler that Kahr's intention behind announcing the meeting was to declare Bavarian independence. If this was true, an egotistical Hitler could not let him steal the glory of revolution. Göring was stressed during the ordeal, as his mother had just passed. Karin had pneumonia, and all the while he was trying to gather the stormtroopers for the revolution. Hitler stormed the beer hall and jumped on the table and fired a shot in the air, shouting, "The national revolution has begun." Hitler motioned with his gun to the ministers to leave the room, and Göring was able to read the reaction of the crowd. He took the podium and shouted, "There is nothing to fear. We are your friends. You've no reason to grumble. You've got your beer." Meanwhile, Hitler and the ministers unwillingly formed the new government, believing General Ludendorff was going to be involved, despite even him not knowing of his involvement. Ludendorff soon arrived and was irate at not being consulted over the plan. Yet there was a problem, as Hitler had to leave in order to settle a street fight between the SA and Bavarian soldiers, leaving Ludendorff in charge of the ministers. The ministers left and abandoned the plot. Kahr quietly moved the state's government to Regensburg, printed pamphlets denouncing their allegiance to the Nazi Party, and ensured the military was not aligned to the Nazis. Meanwhile, Göring finally found time to telephone Karin to tell her not to worry, that he may not come home that night. Even during the coup, his main thought was with Karin. The situation continued to deteriorate, as Hitler and Göring did not act as quickly as Röhm had, who had taken over the military headquarters in Munich. As the morning came, Ludendorff proposed the group march to the center of Munich, believing the army and police would not fire on them because of his reputation. By 11 in the morning, Ludendorff led the column of Nazis towards the center of Munich. The column of 3,000 had to cross the Ludwig Bridge in order to reach the inner city of Munich, but armed policemen were blocking their path. Göring approached alone, informing the officers that they held hostages, and if they were to use force against the Nazis, the hostages and those who resisted would be shot. The police stood down and allowed the column to advance, but they had their weapons confiscated as a precaution. The group continued through Zweibrückenstrasse, heading towards the War Ministry where Röhm was being besieged, but in order to get there, they had to pass through the small street of Residenzstrasse, which was blocked by armed police. The Nazis shouted at the police to surrender, but shots were fired and the Nazis scattered. Göring was shot in the groin and was bleeding heavily from his injury. He was taken by stormtroopers into the house of a furniture dealer named Balin and his wife Ilse, who ironically were Jewish, and Ilse dressed the wound as best she could. Once night had fallen, Göring was sent to Professor von Ach to treat his injuries, and Karin arrived to learn that General von Lossow had issued a warrant for Göring's arrest, and Göring begged her to help him escape from Bavaria. Göring's condition was serious, and so he could not easily be moved. But Karin did receive help from friends in the town of Garmisch to smuggle him there. Göring's recovery was slow as his wounds became reinfected, leaving him bitter about the situation, and before long Göring's presence in Garmisch became well known, and he was arrested and placed under guard at a hospital. The crowd sympathized with Göring, and mass demonstrations occurred outside in support, and with Karin's persistence and support from the police, Göring was smuggled out of Germany and into Austria, where he would be operated on in a hospital in Innsbruck. Following the surgery, Göring would suffer from high fevers and excruciating pain, which he would be given morphine for twice a day. As a result of this, Göring would fight morphine addiction for the rest of his life. Göring spent a considerable amount of time in exile, prohibited from returning to Germany by Hitler, who refused to let him stand trial for the failed putsch. His first assignment would be in February of 1924, when he was to speak at a nationalist convention in Innsbruck. Göring soon took a leadership role for the Nazi Party in Vienna and worked closely with Austrian Nazi Walter Riehl. He stayed at the Tiroler Hof with Karin and was barely able to pay for their stay, with most of their possessions impounded by the Bavarian authorities. At the end of the trial in April, Ludendorff was acquitted, while Hitler was found guilty along with the other Nazi leadership including Göring, who was found guilty in absentia. Göring filed for amnesty, but never received it. The results of the trial should have ended the Nazi Party, but instead it resulted in a resurgence, seeing the Nazis earn a seat in the Reichstag. The Görings left Austria and travelled through Italy before stopping in Rome. They would be given an audience with Benito Mussolini, where they talked at length about the failed Beer Hall Putsch. Following their short stay in Italy, the couple moved into a flat in Odengarten, Sweden, to take care of Karin's mother. But Karin's own health soon started to decline, as she started having epileptic seizures, and as she suffered more from epileptic episodes, Göring's health also deteriorated with his morphine addiction. In 1927, Paul von Hindenburg was elected president and issued a general political amnesty which included Göring, who eagerly returned to his homeland. Göring worked hard to regain his wealth and connect with Hitler for employment and political purposes. Göring's former position as the leader of the SA was currently occupied by Frank von Pfeffer, a wealthy aristocrat who Hitler could not afford to dismiss due to his economic advantages. The Nazi Party was fiscally weak and needed strong economic backers to succeed, and Göring's vulnerable financial status did not help them. Despite this, Göring was accepted back into the Nazi Party and sent to Berlin to work on accumulating wealth. It was at this time that Göring's connection to the airline industry paid off, as his friend, Erhard Milch, senior executive of Lufthansa, got him a job working as a business representative with the Bavarian Motor Works Company. By the winter, Göring had successfully petitioned Hitler that he should be one of the representatives for the Nazi Party in the upcoming Reichstag election. He proved to Hitler he could stand a chance, as he stood against Otto and Gregor Strasser, the brothers who had earlier broken away from the Nazi movement due to their leftist ideology, being driven out eventually by Hitler's cult personality. In fact, Göring's position as a representative suited the Nazi Party, as Göring was able to banter with the elite of society, while Hitler was terrible at small talk and felt uncomfortable in the company of intellectuals. In the election, the Nazis performed poorly, but Goebbels and Göring both took seats in the Reichstag. Hitler and Goebbels were less than pleased, but Göring was ecstatic, as it renewed his family's depleted wealth and allowed him to move into a modern flat with 5 rooms at 7 Badensche Strasse. As a Reichstag deputy, he sat on the Communications Committee, which also oversaw the aviation section. He lobbied to increase funding for the airline industry, which was exclusively held by his friends at Lufthansa, because it was a, quote, great patriotic task, which needed fulfillment. In part, this was also a ploy to build up Germany's military air defense. The push by Göring to finance these industrial giants also worked as a way to bribe the industrialist to side with the Nazi Party. Following the victory in the Reichstag, the Göring family lost Karin's mother on the 25th of September 1931. Karin was barely well enough to attend the funeral in Stockholm, and Göring returned to Berlin to oversee political matters. But on the 17th of October, Karin, who had been ill with tuberculosis, died of heart failure. Göring was devastated at the loss, and he returned to Berlin after the funeral, as he believed it was the only way he could get over her death. After months of political upheaval and multiple chancellors resigning from office, Hitler ascended to the chancellorship on the 30th of January 1933. Göring held 3 positions in Hitler's cabinet: Minister without portfolio, Minister of the Interior for Prussia, and Reich Commissioner for Aviation. As a minister without portfolio, he acted as an ambassador, speaking on behalf of Nazi Germany. While the Minister of the Interior for Prussia was technically under former Chancellor von Pappen's supervision, it did give him authority over the police in the largest and most important German state. Meanwhile, as the Reich Commissioner for Aviation, he had the honor to develop the Air Force of the Reich. He also maintained his role as president of the Reichstag until the Nazis dissolved it on the 5th of March 1933. It would also be in early March that the concentration camps were founded, although Göring's opinion of them differed to the other Nazi leaders, as he felt their role should be one of re-education for those who suffered from political delinquency. Much of the early history of the camps centers around the intense rivalry between Göring, Himmler and Röhm. As a result of this rivalry, Göring created a secret police force, which would patrol Prussia. They would eventually become known as the Geheime Staatspolizei, or Gestapo. Himmler soon became the police chief of Bavaria, and in an effort to keep power away from Himmler, Göring moved the Gestapo on the 26th of April from the Prussian administration to their own headquarters. Hitler wished to unify the police forces and gave the Gestapo to Himmler on the 20th of April 1934. The rivalry with Röhm was also growing at this time, as he was attempting to replace the Reichswehr with the SA, a move which threatened both Hitler and Göring. As an act of defiance, Röhm helped establish nearly 50 concentration camps by the end of 1933, despite Göring's so-called approved concentration camps. The SS, out of their own defiance, founded Dachau concentration camp in the spring of 1933, and fired upon Göring's men when they tried to investigate the unauthorized concentration camp. Hitler forced Himmler to close the camp, yet Göring was outclassed as he lost control of the police to Himmler. Röhm was becoming more bold with his demands, and as a result, Göring allied with Himmler to try to eliminate him. They needed time before they could move on Röhm, but Göring's health was starting to fail. Göring had grown fat as a result of inconsistent eating schedules and overindulgence when entertaining guests. His preferred foods included sandwiches and beer, along with his favorite, which was cake. Göring's sleeping habits weren't much better, as he would stay up late watching films privately, going to bed at 2 or 3 a.m. and requesting to be woken up at 6:30, although Göring hardly needed to be wakened since he suffered from insomnia. In May of 1933, Hitler appointed Göring Reichsmaster of the Hunt and Master of the German Forest. Göring loved the countryside and quickly invoked laws to protect wildlife such as elk, bison, boars, swans, and birds of prey. He restricted the number of hunters allowed and outlawed poaching, hunting on horseback, or the use of traps. It was also due to this love of the forest that he purchased prime real estate in the Schorfheide, a vast area near the Baltic Sea and Polish border. He would build Karin Hall in Schorfheide, near the lake called Wackersee, and it would be here that he would create a sanctuary for both wildlife and himself. It would be a great achievement for Göring, as he designed every aspect of the house, quote, down to the door handles. Just before Himmler took control of the Gestapo away from Göring, Robert Diels came to him with a new tool he had acquired abroad, which could be used to listen in on telephone calls. Göring turned it over to his agents and instructed his research staff officers to start monitoring nearly all high-ranking Nazi officials on Göring's list. Göring received a wave of information, including jokes about him, but he seemed to enjoy them and laugh about it. His most important wiretapping came in a conversation between General Werner von Blomberg, Minister of Defense and head of the Reichswehr, Gruppenführer Karl Ernst, as well as Ernst Röhm. There were frequent conversations held by von Blomberg over concerns surrounding Röhm usurping control of the army, and his fears were backed by Röhm and Ernst's own exchanges. It also confirmed Göring's suspicions of Röhm's hatred for him, as Röhm was heard calling him the Pig Göring and Herr Reaktion, or Mr. Reaction. Göring and Himmler's opportunity would come when Röhm proposed a joint conference between the SA, SS and Reichswehr. This led to growing resentment of Röhm, and if Hitler would not stop him, then the army would not support him. The SA was called to Bad Weissee for a leadership conference, and it was here that the trap would be sprung. Hitler and other top Nazi officials raided the Hanselbauer Hotel on the 30th of June 1934 and arrested Röhm and other SA leaders. Göring was in Berlin, raiding the SA headquarters, where he meticulously went room to room, pointing at individuals, ordering their arrest. The Night of the Long Knives, as it would be known, was an act of political suppression against inner party members, carried out to settle political disagreements. The following year, on the 10th of April 1935, Göring would ask Emmy Sonnemann, an actress he had been dating since 1932, to marry him. It was to be a grand event, with great pomp and circumstance. The streets decorated for the event. Soldiers lined the streets leading to the cathedral, and all traffic was stopped for the procession. Hitler would serve as the best man for Göring at the wedding. However, there was a possibility that the wedding occurred at Hitler's behest, as he believed there were too many eligible men among the high-ranking Nazi members. Following the wedding, Emmy would be crowned as First Lady of the Third Reich by Hitler, and the couple retreated to Karin Hall with a small entourage. Göring slipped away and spent an hour at Karin's tomb in the mausoleum. The next morning, Göring and Emmy left for Wiesbaden, and then went on to Yugoslavia for their honeymoon. Göring was promoted to Reichsmarschall on the 4th of February 1938 following Hitler's dismissal of 6 generals for anti-Nazi views, and his promotion of himself as Commander-in-Chief of German Armed Forces. In March, Austria was invaded and incorporated into the Nazi Reich under the eyes of Göring. Following their annexation, the Austrian Nazi Party wanted Göring to increase propaganda against the Jewish population. Göring was reluctant, as he enjoyed Jewish composers and painters, yet believed they were guilty of profiteering and scheming, leading to the defeat of Germany in World War I. In private conversations with Emmy, he would say, quote, "The Jews were just like any other people, but a bit smarter," which he would often say with a grin. He would also say that they had good and bad people. He felt squeamish when Goebbels and Himmler talked about the extermination of the Jews, and would often excuse himself. The Görings had their first and only child, Edda, on the 2nd of June 1938, and Hitler would act as the newborn's godfather. In the following year, on the 1st of September 1939, German troops invaded Poland, and Göring would ascend to the pinnacle of his power. Hitler had selected Göring to be his heir should anything ever happen to him. As the war progressed, Göring started to argue with Hitler over strategic decisions. Göring wanted to start the air assault on Britain, while Hitler wanted to hold them for the attack on France. Hitler instead set his eyes on the Nordic countries, although Göring had personally guaranteed Sweden's neutrality, despite Hitler's own wishes to invade Sweden for their iron ore. Göring was able to broker a treaty in which Sweden would remain independent and, in return, give the Nazis the iron ore they needed. Following the defeat of the British at Dunkirk, Göring requested an immediate attack on the British. He believed the disorientated state of the British military would allow for even the most ill-conceived plan to succeed. Hitler refused, believing Britain would surrender in the next few weeks, unlike Göring, who knew they would only surrender once the final blow had been dealt. The good weather turned terrible, which prohibited them from flying because Göring wanted the most accurate bombing raids to destroy ports, factories and airfields. When the Luftwaffe was finally unleashed, they met heavy resistance from the RAF. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 1,500 planes as they underestimated the advancement in British radar and code decryption. This would be the beginning of a year-long campaign of bombing England, which became known as the Blitz. On the 9th of August 1940, Göring and Hitler had an argument over their next military moves. Hitler wished to attack the Soviet Union as a preventative measure. Göring pulled Hitler up on his hypocrisy. As Hitler had stated in his biography Mein Kampf, he would never involve the German people in a two-front war, similar to the Great War. Hitler was outraged over Göring's dismissal of his plan, and even more so that Göring ignored him to continue arguing his point. Hitler had become obsessed with attacking the Soviet Union, and Göring pleaded with Hitler to look at Napoleon's failure to conquer Russia. As comparable to the British, he argued that the Russians would not broker peace. In 1941, Göring became involved with his most infamous interest, his love of art. Göring had long planned the Hermann Göring Museum, an art gallery which he planned to open in 1953. He loved Renaissance and Dutch paintings, as he was well versed in the two. He had 4 stately homes that needed to be filled, and he enjoyed staring at paintings for hours. Göring had multiple staff members who helped him acquire the art. He even told them not to worry about the race of the individuals selling the art, and instead focus only on the art. When further anti-Jewish laws were enacted, Göring used his power to assist Jewish art dealers into Switzerland to avoid prosecution. Göring also worked closely with directors of national institutes such as the Louvre to build special bunkers to protect the art from bombing raids. Whilst Göring did protect collections, he plundered others, having trains full of art shipped back to Germany to be displayed in public museums or private collections. It was an impressive collection with superb record-keeping by Andreas Hosfer and his assistant Gisela Limberger. The two created a detailed ledger which included photographs of every piece of art when it was bought and sold, along with the specific detail of what had been restored. All money made from the sale of art would be directed towards the construction of the Hermann Göring Museum. On the 31st of July 1941, Göring ordered Himmler's right-hand man Reinhard Heydrich to make, quote, necessary preparations for a total solution of the Jewish question. It was this command that would, the following year, in January 1942, culminate in Heydrich calling the infamous Wannsee Conference, in which he laid out the details by which millions of Jews across Europe would be exterminated in purpose-built death camps. Although Göring had little involvement in the day-to-day operations of the final solution, he did give the order for the SS to begin operations to liquidate the Jews, and it was this order, more than anything else, that would result in both Göring's death sentence at the Nuremberg trials and cement his reputation as being amongst the primary instigators of the Holocaust. By the end of 1941 and into 1942, it was becoming clear that the Russian campaign would not be over quickly. The troops, supplies, logistics and technology needed to defeat Russia was outpacing the Nazis' ability to produce them. Göring was still in charge of labor, currency and rationing, but this changed on the 21st of March 1942, when he announced Fritz Sauckel would take over the duties of assigning the use of labor. While Göring was still to be consulted on the matters, he effectively removed his hands from the cruelty and extermination of the Jewish people, which was to begin in Eastern Europe. Sauckel filled the factories with slave labor and ordered they be worked to death. Hitler and Göring's relationship became more strained as the war went on. The Allies increasingly became unopposed as the number of planes protecting German cities diminished. Hitler ordered an all-out assault on England by the Luftwaffe, a feat which was both impossible and suicidal, and Göring was distraught over it. Hitler would neither accept Göring's advice or take his resignation. Göring was stuck. As the Third Reich was disintegrating, Göring withdrew himself from the decision-making process, and he wasn't present during the D-Day invasion. His last ounce of gravitas was used to release his nephew, who had been arrested following the failed Operation Valkyrie. He was suspected of being part of the coup, but there was no evidence to prove it. As the Red Army advanced in 1945, they were closing in on Carrion Hall. Göring had the art removed and a demolition team rigged the house to explode. As Germany collapsed, Göring and Emmy escaped into Bavaria, where US First Lieutenant Jerome N. Shapiro found him stuck in a traffic jam and brought him into American custody. He remarked how the Görings were happy to be found by the Americans, as if they were escaping a bad dream. Göring was taken to the 7th Army Interrogation Center in Augsburg, and it was here where he talked freely to the Americans. In the reports, they noted, quote, "Göring is by no means the comical figure he has been depicted so many times in the newspaper reports. He is neither stupid nor a fool, but generally cool and calculating. He is certainly not a man to be underrated. Although he tried to soft-pedal many of the most outrageous crimes committed by Germany, he said enough to show that he is as much responsible for the policies within Germany. Göring is at all times an actor who does not disappoint his audience." Göring painted a vivid, startling and proven authentic account of life in Nazi Germany, which had eluded the Allies for so long. He told the Allies he was unable to save all of the art, and some had fallen into the Russians' hands. Göring helped the Allies recover all the art they could, except for the ones that had fallen into the hands of the Russians in Berlin. Göring was moved to a small suite in the Palace Hotel at Mondorf in Luxembourg. This would serve as the jail for many high-ranking Nazis, such as Joachim von Ribbentrop, Admiral Karl Dönitz, Albert Speer, and Hjalmar Schacht. And it could be said that there was some irony here, as Dr. Robert M. Kempner was to prosecute the Nuremberg trials, and he was once the youngest prosecuting counsel in the Prussian police department when Göring fired him in 1933. Leading up to the trial, Göring was detoxed from the morphine and lost significant weight. There were unannounced room inspections to ensure there was no contraband, and before the trial, Dr. Kempner indicted Göring with all 4 counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to plan and commit all 3. In response to the upcoming trial, he said, quote, "It's just a cut and dried political affair, and I'm prepared for the consequences. I have no doubt that the press will play a bigger part in the decision than the judges, and I'm sure that the Russian and French judges, at least, already have their instructions. I can answer for anything I have done, and I can't answer for anything I haven't done. But the victors are the judges." The trial at Nuremberg would see the remaining Nazi leadership turn on one another, mainly Albert Speer and Göring. Göring tried to keep the other Nazis in line, but Speer won out in the end. Colonel Andrus successfully found a way to lessen Göring's influence by separating the lunch groups into specific categories to minimize Göring's authority. And it worked. The judges found Göring guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced him to death. Göring was to be hung, but he requested to be executed by firing squad as it was a soldier's death. His request was denied, and the security of the prison was tightened to prevent the war criminals from cheating the hangman's noose. In the final days of the war, all Nazi leaders carried poison with them in case they were captured, yet medicines were heavily monitored by the guards, preventing the possibility of poison pills being slipped to the defendants. The executions were set for 2 a.m. on the 16th of October 1946, and the next series of events is where the mystery begins. The prison chaplain, Captain Henry Gereke, saw Göring in his cell in the evening before his execution and noted his depressed state. When Captain Gereke left, Lieutenant John West came for his nightly inspection and found no contraband. West stated Göring was very happy and talked at length to him during the search. At 9:30 p.m., Dr. Floyke and Lieutenant Arthur McLinden visited to give Göring his nightly pill and left 3 minutes later when Private First Class Gordon Bingham came for guard duty. At 10:30, Private First Class Harold Johnson took over for Bingham. Johnson noticed Göring's body was stiff and not moving around 10:44 p.m. and by the time the senior guard officers reached Göring's cell, he was dead from cyanide poisoning. Göring wrote 2 farewell letters. The first rebuts the claims of the trial, while the second was an affectionate letter to Emmy. He claimed to have always had a vial of cyanide, and he even wrote a letter to Colonel Andrus bragging about having one. In his place, Ribbentrop would be the first to be executed, with the executions only lasting an hour and 15 minutes. Their bodies would be placed into caskets and taken to a crematorium. The building had been heavily guarded in case of civil disturbance, and once the bodies were verified and cremated, they were driven to the countryside and dumped into a gutter. Hermann Göring remains one of the more complex and fascinating members of Hitler's inner circle. His record as a fighter ace in the First World War, along with his drug addiction, love of the arts, and the finer things in life, undoubtedly made him a compelling figure at first glance. However, he was also greedy, selfish, and ruthless, as time and again he schemed against his enemies in the Nazi regime, used his power to make himself rich, and at all times placed his own interests above those of the Nazi Party and even his country. Furthermore, his place as being one of the instigators of the final solution has ensured that no matter how charismatic or brave he may have been early on in his life, he was, in the end, corrupted by power, becoming just another mass murderer addicted to excess. What do you think of Hermann Göring? Do you think he could have mustered the strength to stand up to Hitler, or was he doomed to cowardice? Please let us know in the comments section below. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.